Whenever you make a sound in a normal room, it echoes back. That's just how physics operates. However, there exists a psychological version of this that most people are unaware of. A child emotionally reaches out when they need something to come back. Not necessarily words. At times, all it takes is a glance, or a hand, a subtle change in someone's face that says, "I received you. You are real." Yet when nothing echoes back, when the sound just disappears and fades into silence, the child doesn't conclude that the room is at fault. Children don't think that way. They conclude that the sound wasn't worth echoing. That's where it begins. We have spent decades in psychology treating trauma as something that happens to you, something you could point to and say, that's where it happened. A car crash, an assault, something with a clear before and after. And that makes sense for a lot of people. However, it's left an entire category of suffering without a name and without much sympathy. Because from an outside perspective, it may not look like trauma. The house was still standing. The parents may even be there. Nobody's going to write a memoir about the birthday where everyone forgot, or the time they cried in their room for an hour and no one came, watching their mother's eyes go somewhere else every time they tried to say something that mattered to them. The things that didn't happen don't feel like they count. You can't really explain them to someone without feeling like you're being dramatic, but they do leave marks, quiet and persistent, and just because they're invisible doesn't mean they aren't real. Psychologists call it childhood emotional neglect, and the reason it stayed understudied for so long is partly because of how it works. It's defined not by what occurred, but by what consistently didn't. The emotional attunement that never came, the mirroring that was absent. And here's the developmental reality underneath that. Children learn to understand their own inner world the same way they learn language, through someone reflecting it back. A caregiver who says, "You look sad right now. Is that right?" is doing something profound. They're teaching the child that internal states exist, that they're nameable, that they matter enough to be witnessed. When that never happens, or happens so rarely it doesn't register, the child grows into an adult who is genuinely, sometimes bafflingly, unable to identify what they're feeling. There's a clinical term for this, alexithymia, difficulty identifying and describing one's own emotional states, and studies have consistently found higher rates of it in people who experienced emotional neglect early in life. It's not a personality quirk, it's a gap left by an absence. Imagine spending your whole life in a room where nothing echoes and then being told, "Just speak up." What this produces in adulthood is a profile that is deeply familiar to clinicians and deeply confusing to the people living it. These are often high-functioning people, competent, reliable, the kind of person everyone assumes is fine because they present as fine, because presenting as fine was the survival skill they mastered so young they don't even remember learning it. Jonice Webb, the clinician who first formally defined childhood emotional neglect, describes patients who come to her not with a clear complaint, but with a kind of vague, persistent wrongness, a sense that everyone else has access to some emotional frequency they just can't tune into. Not depression exactly, not anxiety in the textbook sense, something more like flatness, a life experienced slightly behind glass. And then there's relationships, which is where it can get really painful to watch, because the person who grew up feeling invisible doesn't just find it hard to connect with people, they often sabotage the connection right when it starts to feel real. For example, someone gives them a genuine compliment, and they deflect it or laugh it off. Or maybe someone loves them consistently, without conditions, but it feels almost suffocating instead of safe, wrong somehow, like you're waiting for it to be taken away. Which makes complete sense. If love was unpredictable growing up, you would have eventually stopped counting on it, right? So you're forced to adapt. You became someone who doesn't need anyone and has everything handled, who's totally fine on their own. That might look like strength from the outside, but mostly it's just a very old coping mechanism. The desire for closeness was never fully gone. Rather, it was so deeply buried that you no longer felt it either. You know, needs don't just leave. Eventually, they stop making noise since they learned noise doesn't help. A 2024 scoping review published in Child Abuse and Neglect, analyzing 25 separate studies, found consistent evidence that people who experienced neglect as kids struggle significantly with managing their emotions as adults. And the researchers themselves pointed out that emotional neglect is still one of the least studied forms of childhood pain out there, which, when you think about it, says everything. The wound that's hardest to see is also the one we've spent the least time trying to understand. Here's what I really want you to understand, and I'm only going to say it once. The way you learned to behave wasn't a mistake, rather a solution, a smart, incredibly well-adapted response to a situation that required you to shrink yourself down, to need and expect less. The kid who went quiet learned that being quiet kept them safe. Likewise, the kid who became the funny one learned that making people laugh was the only reliable way to get attention. Sometimes they threw themselves into their studies, or became the caretaker, or, in unfortunate cases, kind of just disappeared. They've lent heavily on the only tools available to them, and did so remarkably well. The only problem is that we don't automatically stop using a coping mechanism just because we don't need it anymore. You're not in that room anymore, but your body hasn't fully caught up with that yet, still flinching when someone gets close, feeling uneasy when someone is genuinely kind to you, still struggling to make sense of your own emotions like you're trying to hear something through a thick wall. But luckily, it's not permanent. The brain is remarkably capable of changing, even after a difficult childhood, and therapy designed around this kind of experience can make a real difference. I'm not saying this to wrap this up nicely, since it deserves more than a tidy ending. Healing from this is slow, and it involves grieving something strange, the absence of things that should have been there. How do you mourn something that never happened? How do you process a feeling with no particular memory attached to it? It turns out with a lot of persistence, and usually with help. But it starts somewhere smaller than therapy. It starts with deciding that your own experience is worth taking seriously. Just because no one showed up when you needed them doesn't mean you weren't worth showing up for. You always were. And what that actually looks like day to day is a lot less dramatic than you'd expect. You don't need this big emotional breakthrough. Start by noticing you're angry, and instead of immediately pushing it down or telling yourself you're overreacting, just sitting with it for a second, letting it exist. It's catching yourself brush off a compliment and actually pausing to ask yourself why you did that. Small moments of just paying attention to your own inner world that might sound insignificant until you realize that for some people, nobody ever taught them that their inner world was worth paying attention to at all. That stuff doesn't, unfortunately, change overnight, but every time you check in with yourself honestly, something shifts a little. And for someone who grew up feeling unheard, learning to hear yourself is kind of the whole point. There's a certain type of person who ends up watching something like this, who's scrolling at midnight and stumbles across the words emotional neglect and feels something shift. It's like quiet recognition. Something in it feels uncomfortably familiar. If that's you right now, I want you to pay attention to that feeling. It's not that having a name for something magically fixes it, but because that recognition is actually your nervous system doing something it maybe never learned to do properly. It's echoing something back to itself. Faintly, perhaps, but it's there. The sound was always worth echoing. It just needed a different room. And if this resonated with you or put words to something you've been carrying around for a while, it would mean a lot if you subscribed. I make these deep dives regularly, and there's a lot more to explore. There's also a join button on the channel if you ever want to directly support what I'm doing here. Check out my other videos on the screen that I think you'll see yourself in. See you there.